What happens when a small-town police department, riddled with corruption, gets a new chief who doesn't play by anyone's rules? Meet Sierra Langston, a fearless detective with a past as sharp as her instincts. But her first day in Crestwood starts with more than just tension. It starts with coffee being hurled at her by a bitter, arrogant officer. What he doesn't know: Sierra's not just his new colleague. She's his boss. As Sierra unravels the web of deceit in Crestwood, she faces cryptic threats, explosive danger, and a betrayal that cuts close to home. But in a town where loyalty is a gamble and the truth comes at a deadly price, the question is, how far is Sierra willing to go to clean up the mess, and who will try to stop her? What would you do if you found out someone in your team was working with criminals? Would you confront them, or play it smart and gather evidence? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're ready for a story filled with action, suspense, and jaw-dropping twists, don't miss this one. Be sure to like, subscribe, and share for more thrilling stories like this, and stay tuned, because you won't believe how it ends. It was an unusually chilly morning in the city of Crestwood. Officer Richard "Rick" Dunbar, a seasoned police officer with a reputation that preceded him, was stationed at a local diner on the south side of town. Known for his short temper and questionable conduct, Rick wasn't exactly the poster child for integrity. He harbored deep-seated biases and often let his prejudices dictate his actions on duty. The bell above the diner door jingled, signaling another customer entering. Rick, seated at the counter nursing a black coffee, barely looked up from his phone. His attention was glued to an online argument he was having in a group chat with his friends, which had quickly devolved into a toxic exchange of conspiracy theories and divisive rhetoric. He muttered under his breath, oblivious to the world around him. The woman who entered the diner exuded an air of quiet confidence. She wore a sharp, dark suit, and her natural curls framed her face elegantly. Her name was Detective Sierra Langston, though few people in Crestwood knew her yet. She was new to town, having transferred from a larger city, where she had worked undercover on some of the most dangerous cases in the country. Her reputation was stellar, but her arrival in Crestwood had been kept under wraps. On purpose, Sierra scanned the diner, noticing Rick's uniform. She offered a polite nod as she approached the counter. "Morning," she said, her voice steady but warm. Rick glanced up briefly, his sharp eyes narrowing. "Morning," he grumbled before returning to his phone. The tension in the air was palpable, though Sierra brushed it off. She had encountered officers like Rick before. Men who assumed authority was their birthright, who wielded their badge like a weapon rather than a shield. Sierra took a seat a few stools down from Rick and ordered a coffee. The waitress, an older woman named Martha, smiled as she poured it. "Welcome to town, honey," Martha said kindly. "You're new around here?" Sierra smiled back. "Yes, ma'am. Just moved in yesterday." Rick's ears perked up at that. "Moved here, huh?" He muttered loud enough for Sierra to hear. "From where?" "The city." Sierra met his gaze, her expression calm. "That's right." Rick scoffed, leaning back in his stool. "Figures. People from the city think they can just waltz in here and fit right in. But things work differently in Crestwood. You'll find that out soon enough." Sierra didn't respond, choosing instead to sip her coffee. But Martha shot Rick a disapproving glare. "Rick, don't start," she warned. "Let the lady enjoy her morning." Rick ignored her, his irritation bubbling beneath the surface. He felt challenged by Sierra's composed demeanor, her refusal to engage in his passive-aggressive remarks. His hand tightened around his coffee mug as his anger simmered. Sierra finished her coffee and stood to leave, placing a few bills on the counter. "Thanks for the coffee, Martha. Have a good day." She nodded at Rick, though her expression remained neutral. Rick couldn't let it go. As she walked past him, he stood abruptly, his chair screeching against the floor. "Hey!" he called after her. "You think you're better than me, huh? Just because you've got a fancy suit and city manners?" Sierra stopped in her tracks, turning to face him. Her eyes locked with his, unwavering. "I don't think I'm better than anyone, officer. I suggest you calm down before you do something you'll regret." Rick's face turned red with anger. Without thinking, he grabbed his coffee mug and hurled its contents at her. The steaming liquid splashed across her suit, staining the fabric and scalding her skin. The diner fell silent as everyone watched in shock. Sierra gasped, the pain sharp and immediate, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she stood tall, her expression hardening. Rick smirked, clearly pleased with himself. "Welcome to Crestwood," he sneered. Before Sierra could respond, the sound of screeching tires outside caught everyone's attention. A black SUV came to a sudden stop in front of the diner, and the doors flew open. 3 masked men, armed with automatic rifles, stormed inside. "Everyone down!" One of them shouted, his voice muffled by the ski mask. "This is a robbery." Chaos erupted as customers and staff scrambled for cover. Rick instinctively reached for his gun, but one of the robbers was faster. He fired a warning shot that shattered the diner's front window. "I said down." The man barked, pointing his weapon at Rick. "Unless you want a bullet in your head, cop." Rick froze, his bravado evaporating in an instant. He dropped to the floor, his hands raised. Sierra, however, remained calm. Her training kicked in as she assessed the situation. The robbers were disorganized, yelling at each other as they herded everyone into a corner, wallets and phones. "Now!" another robber demanded, waving his rifle. He approached Sierra, who had yet to move. "You deaf, lady?" I said. Before he could finish, Sierra acted. She grabbed a fork from the counter and jammed it into his wrist, forcing him to drop his weapon. The man screamed in pain as she delivered a swift kick to his chest, sending him crashing into a table. The other 2 robbers turned their attention to her, their weapons raised. Sierra dove behind the counter as bullets tore through the air. Rick cowered nearby, his face pale. "What the hell are you doing?" he hissed. "You're gonna get us killed." Sierra ignored him, grabbing a coffee pot from the counter. She threw it at one of the robbers, hitting him square in the face. The man stumbled back, blinded by the hot liquid. Seizing the opportunity, Sierra lunged at him, disarming him with a precise maneuver. She turned his weapon on the remaining robber, who froze. "Drop it," she commanded, her voice cold and authoritative. The man hesitated, then complied, his rifle clattering to the floor. The room was silent except for the labored breathing of the subdued robbers. Sierra kept her weapon trained on them as she addressed the stunned patrons. "Is anyone hurt?" she asked. When no one answered, she turned her attention to Rick, who was still huddled on the floor. "Officer," she said sharply. "Call for backup." Rick scrambled for his radio, fumbling with it as he relayed the situation to dispatch. His hands trembled, his earlier arrogance completely gone. Sierra's gaze never wavered as she held the robbers at gunpoint. The adrenaline coursing through her veins was familiar, but the pain from the coffee burn on her chest was a constant reminder of Rick's earlier actions. When the sound of approaching sirens filled the air, Sierra allowed herself a brief moment of relief. But she knew this was far from over. Rick's actions had crossed a line, and she wasn't about to let it slide. The sirens grew louder as squad cars screeched to a halt in front of the diner. Uniformed officers poured out, weapons drawn, their faces grim. Sierra stood her ground, the disarmed robbers lying face down on the floor with their hands behind their heads. Her focus didn't waver, even as she felt the weight of all eyes in the diner on her. Officer Rick Dunbar, still pale and visibly shaken, scrambled to his feet as the first officers entered. "They're disarmed," he called out, eager to regain some semblance of control. "Secure the scene." He gestured at Sierra. "She helped," he added grudgingly, though his tone made it sound like she was more trouble than help. The lead officer, Sergeant Mark Holloway, gave Rick a curt nod before approaching Sierra. "Ma'am, we'll take it from here," Holloway said, motioning to his team to cuff the robbers. Sierra handed over the weapon she'd taken from the robber, her movements deliberate. "The firearm's safety is on. The fingerprints will match," she said calmly, as if she were reciting a shopping list. Holloway raised an eyebrow but didn't question her. Something about her demeanor screamed experience, though her burnt and stained suit suggested she wasn't having an ordinary day. "Is anyone hurt?" Holloway asked, looking around. "No injuries," Sierra replied, though she winced slightly as she adjusted her jacket. The burn from Rick's coffee was still stinging. But she refused to show weakness in front of him. She glanced at Rick, who stood by the door barking orders at junior officers, trying to reassert his authority. His words, however, lacked their usual confidence. As the officers processed the scene, Sierra stepped aside, grabbing a handful of napkins from the counter to dab at her burn. Martha, the diner's waitress, approached cautiously. "Are you all right, dear?" she asked, concern etched into her features. "I'm fine," Sierra replied softly. "Thank you." Martha glanced at Rick and lowered her voice. I saw what he did. You let me know if you need a witness. Sierra smiled faintly, appreciating the gesture. I'll be fine. But thank you. Outside, Rick was pacing as his adrenaline turned to frustration. He was still stewing over Sierra's earlier calm defiance. Now, seeing her confidently interact with his colleagues, his resentment boiled over. He hated feeling outmatched, and Sierra had managed to outshine him not just once, but twice in the span of an hour. As the suspects were loaded into the back of patrol cars, Sergeant Holloway approached Sierra again. That was some quick thinking in there, he said. You saved lives. Thank you, Sierra replied, her tone measured. Though I wish the situation had been avoided altogether. Holloway studied her for a moment. You're not from around here, are you? No. She said. Just moved to Crestwood. Today's my second day. Rick, overhearing the exchange, cut in. She thinks she's some kind of hero. But she got lucky. He looked directly at Holloway, ignoring Sierra entirely. You should have seen her in there, Mark. She's reckless. Almost got herself killed. Sierra turned to Rick, her calm mask slipping just slightly. Reckless? You threw hot coffee at an unarmed woman, then cowered on the floor when armed gunmen entered the room. Her voice was ice. If anyone's reckless, it's you. The air between them turned electric, every officer in earshot suddenly very interested in the conversation. Rick's face turned an ugly shade of red. Watch your mouth. He growled. You don't know who you're talking to. Neither do you, Sierra replied evenly. She turned back to Holloway. If you'll excuse me, Sergeant, I'll be leaving now. My statement should cover everything. Holloway nodded, clearly intrigued by the dynamic playing out before him. We'll be in touch if we need anything else. Sierra walked to her car, ignoring Rick's muttered curses behind her. But as she opened the door, she paused. A familiar itch crept up her spine, a sixth sense honed from years of high-stakes situations. Something didn't feel right. That evening, Sierra sat in her small apartment, replaying the events of the day in her mind. She had unpacked only the essentials. And her living room was still cluttered with boxes. The scarred, battle-worn duffel bag that contained her personal weaponry and tactical gear sat by the couch, a silent reminder of her previous life. She leaned back, staring at the ceiling. The robbers at the diner hadn't seemed like the usual desperate criminals. Their actions had been chaotic, but their equipment was far too sophisticated for a random smash and grab. Automatic rifles weren't common in Crestwood, and their demeanor suggested they were amateurs, not seasoned criminals. Someone had equipped them. Her phone buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. She picked it up and frowned. The caller ID was blocked. Years in law enforcement had taught her to expect trouble when her phone rang late at night. Detective Langston, she answered, her voice steady. A low voice on the other end greeted her. Impressive work today, Detective. Or should I say, Chief Langston. Sierra froze, her grip tightening on the phone. Who is this? Someone who knows more about you than you'd like, the voice replied. I also know you're not here by accident. Crestwood's got its skeletons, and you're here to dig them up. But you'll want to tread lightly. Today was just a taste. The line went dead. Sierra stared at the phone, her heart pounding. She had deliberately kept her new position quiet, even within the department. As far as most of the officers in Crestwood knew, she was just another detective joining the force. The fact that this stranger knew her true role meant one thing: her arrival in Crestwood wasn't as low profile as she'd hoped. Meanwhile, across town, Rick Dunbar was nursing his wounded ego at his usual watering hole. The bar was dimly lit and reeked of cheap beer and cigarette smoke, but it was where Rick felt most at home. He was ranting to a group of off-duty officers, spinning a tale about how Sierra had nearly botched the robbery takedown. She's got no respect, Rick slurred. Walks in here thinking she's God's gift to law enforcement. Probably one of those diversity hires. One of the officers, a younger cop named Jeff, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I don't know. Man. She handled those guys pretty well. You should have seen the way Rick slammed his beer bottle down, cutting Jeff off. She got lucky. That's all it was. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of a phone vibrating. Rick pulled his own phone from his pocket, frowning as he saw an anonymous text message. She's going to be your problem soon enough. Be ready. Rick stared at the message, his beer forgotten. Something about it sent a shiver down his spine, though he'd never admit it. He looked around the bar, suddenly feeling exposed, as if someone was watching him. Outside, a black SUV idled in the shadows. Inside, the driver watched Rick through the windshield. A faint smirk on their lips. The quiet streets of Crestwood were blanketed in darkness as the black SUV pulled away from the bar, its taillights glowing faintly before disappearing around the corner. Inside, the driver made a call. The voice on the other end answered immediately. "She's sharper than expected," the driver said, their tone even. "Handled the situation at the diner with precision. She's not just here to play detective." The voice on the other end hummed in thought. "She's more than a problem. She's a threat. Keep an eye on her, and the idiot officer who's bound to cause trouble." "Yes, sir." The call ended, and the driver smirked to themselves. The game was only beginning. Sierra woke early the next morning. Her internal alarm clock kicking in before dawn. The weight of the anonymous call from the previous night hung heavy on her mind, but she pushed it aside for the time being. If someone wanted to rattle her, they would have to try harder than cryptic phone calls. Years in undercover work had taught her to expect the unexpected, and to never let fear take root. Her first official day on the job as Crestwood's new police chief was hours away, but she had already decided she wouldn't announce herself immediately. She wanted to observe the dynamics of the precinct firsthand, to see who her allies and obstacles would be. And she already knew Rick Dunbar was going to be a problem, after dressing in plain clothes, a leather jacket, dark jeans, and boots. Sierra strapped her sidearm to her hip. Her badge remained tucked away in her pocket for now. She grabbed a strong cup of coffee and stepped outside into the cool morning air. The streets were eerily quiet, save for the occasional car rumbling by. It was the kind of quiet that Sierra had learned to distrust. As she drove toward the precinct, her instincts prickled. A black SUV had been trailing her for several blocks. She glanced at it through her rearview mirror, her mind cataloging every detail: dark-tinted windows, no visible plates, and a driver who stayed just far enough behind to avoid suspicion, at least to someone untrained. Sierra's lips curved into a faint smile. Amateurs, she thought. She quickly turned down a side street, accelerating slightly as she weaved through a series of narrow alleys. The SUV tried to follow, but Sierra knew Crestwood's layout better than most after her meticulous preparation before moving to town. She led them through a dead-end street that appeared to trap her, but she knew better. Sierra parked, turned off her engine, and slipped out of her car. She hid behind a dumpster, waiting. Moments later, the SUV rolled into view, its engine rumbling softly. The driver stepped out, holding a phone and scanning the area. He was tall, wearing a dark hoodie and gloves, his face partially obscured by the hood. Sierra moved like a shadow, circling behind him. When she was close enough, she drew her weapon and aimed it at the back of his head. "Drop the phone and keep your hands where I can see them." The man froze, his body stiffening. Slowly, he raised his hands, dropping the phone onto the pavement. "You're good," he said, his voice calm. "But not good enough." Before Sierra could respond, the man pivoted with shocking speed, knocking the gun out of her hand with a well-placed strike. The weapon clattered to the ground, and Sierra ducked just in time to avoid his follow-up punch. She countered with a swift jab to his ribs, forcing him to stumble back. The two exchanged blows in the narrow alley, the sounds of fists meeting flesh echoing off the brick walls. Sierra moved with calculated precision, her strikes sharp and efficient, but the man was stronger than she anticipated. He grabbed her arm and slammed her against the wall, pinning her. "Who sent you?" Sierra demanded, her voice low but fierce. The man smirked, his hood falling back to reveal a scar running down his jawline. "You'll find out soon enough," he said. Then, with surprising agility, he kneed her in the stomach and shoved her aside. Before Sierra could recover, he bolted back to the SUV, speeding off into the distance. Breathing heavily, Sierra picked up her weapon and dusted herself off. Her ribs ached, but she'd had worse. What bothered her wasn't the fight, it was the man's words. He wasn't just following her out of curiosity. Someone had sent him, and whoever it was knew more about her than she was comfortable with. By the time Sierra arrived at the precinct, the adrenaline had faded, replaced by cold determination. She entered the building through the side entrance, avoiding the front desk where officers congregated. The squad room was alive with activity, officers talking, phones ringing, and the occasional burst of laughter. It all seemed normal, but Sierra's trained eye picked up on the undercurrents of tension. The department wasn't running like a well-oiled machine, it was fractured, Rick Dunbar was leaning against his desk, holding court with a group of officers as he recounted a heavily embellished version of the diner incident. And then, I told the guy to drop his weapon, and boom, he hit the ground. No one else could have handled it like that. Jeff, the younger officer from the bar, shifted uncomfortably. Didn't the woman handle most of it, though? The one from the city? Rick shot him a glare. She was in the way. I had it under control. Sierra approached quietly, her footsteps deliberate. Rick didn't notice her until she was standing just a few feet away. When he finally looked up, his expression twisted into a scowl. You again? He sneered. What are you doing here? Sierra held his gaze, her expression unreadable. Observing. Rick crossed his arms. We don't need tourists in the squad room. You should leave before you embarrass yourself. Sierra tilted her head slightly, studying him. Embarrass myself? Like when you threw coffee at an unarmed woman yesterday? Or when you hid on the floor while I dealt with the gunman? The squad room went quiet, all eyes turning toward them. Rick's face turned red, and he took a step closer. Listen, lady, that's Chief Langston to you, Sierra interrupted, her voice sharp as a blade. She pulled her badge from her pocket and held it up for all to see. As of this morning, I'm your new boss. The room erupted into a mixture of murmurs and stunned silence. Rick's jaw dropped, and for once, he was at a loss for words. Sierra tucked her badge away, her gaze sweeping over the room. Starting today, things are going to change around here. And trust me, if you can't keep up, you'll be the first to go. Rick glared at her, his fists clenched, but he said nothing. Sierra turned and walked toward the chief's office, her presence commanding the room. As she entered her new office, she closed the door behind her and exhaled. The real battle was only beginning. The atmosphere in the precinct was electric after Sierra revealed herself as the new chief. Officers exchanged glances and whispers, some impressed by her confidence and others visibly uncomfortable. Rick Dunbar, however, was livid. His pride, already battered from the diner incident, was now obliterated. He stormed into the break room, slamming the door behind him. Sierra, meanwhile, took a moment to familiarize herself with her new office. It was larger than she expected but cluttered with files, outdated equipment, and a faint smell of old coffee. A large wooden desk sat in the center, covered in paperwork that looked like it hadn't been sorted in months. The walls were adorned with fading plaques and awards, signs of a department that had likely seen better days. She sat down in the creaky chair, leaned back, and let her thoughts settle. Her phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was a message from an unknown number. You've stirred the pot, Chief. Watch your back. Sierra's jaw tightened. It wasn't the first warning she'd received since coming to Crestwood, but this one felt closer, more personal. She tucked her phone into her pocket and stood, scanning the room. The office had a large window that overlooked the squad room, allowing her to see the officers bustling about. Rick had re-emerged, his face twisted with anger as he muttered to a group of his cronies. Sierra knew she couldn't waste time trying to win over everyone. Change would be met with resistance. Especially from someone like Rick. But if she let his insubordination fester, it would infect the entire department. She made a mental note to deal with him sooner rather than later. A knock on her door pulled her from her thoughts. Sergeant Mark Holloway, the officer from the diner, stood in the doorway. He looked cautious, as though unsure of how to approach her. Chief Langston, he said, stepping inside. Welcome to Crestwood. Thank you, Sergeant, Sierra replied. What can I do for you? Holloway hesitated. I just wanted to say that some of us are glad you're here. This department's needed leadership for a long time. Sierra raised an eyebrow. And the rest of you? Holloway offered a wry smile. Let's just say they're resistant to change. Rick Dunbar, for one, has been here for over a decade. He's got friends in high places, and he's not shy about throwing his weight around. I've noticed, Sierra said dryly. Is there anything else I should know? Holloway glanced toward the squad room before lowering his voice. We've got problems, Chief. Serious ones. Corruption, misconduct, you name it. The previous chief turned a blind eye, but it's gotten worse over the last few years. Crestwood's not the quiet little town it used to be. There's something bigger going on here, something that keeps me awake at night. Sierra studied him carefully. Holloway's tone was sincere. And his posture hinted at years of pent-up frustration. Do you have specifics? Not yet, Holloway admitted. But I've seen the signs. Large amounts of cash changing hands. Evidence going missing. And there's been an increase in violent crimes that don't add up. It feels coordinated. Sierra nodded slowly. Thank you for bringing this to me. I'll look into it. Holloway gave her a firm nod. Just watch your back, Chief. Not everyone here will take kindly to you digging into their business. As he left, Sierra sat back in her chair, her mind racing. Holloway's warning confirmed what she'd already suspected: there were forces at work in Crestwood far more dangerous than a bitter cop like Rick Dunbar. And if corruption was as entrenched as Holloway suggested, she was walking into a hornet's nest. Later that afternoon, Sierra decided to conduct a routine patrol of the city. She wanted to see Crestwood for herself, beyond the files and reports on her desk. She changed into plain clothes to avoid drawing attention and took one of the department's unmarked cars. As she drove through the streets, she noted the contrasts within the town: well-kept suburban neighborhoods sitting uncomfortably close to crumbling apartment complexes and abandoned buildings. Her route eventually took her to the diner from the previous day. The shattered window had been boarded up, and a "closed for repairs" sign hung on the door. Sierra parked nearby and stepped out, scanning the street. Something about the area felt off, too quiet for a usually busy part of town. Her instincts flared when she noticed a black SUV parked down the street. It was identical to the one that had followed her that morning. She casually approached a storefront, pretending to browse the display, while keeping the SUV in her peripheral vision. The driver was still inside, their figure barely visible behind the tinted windows. Sierra reached for her phone, intending to call the precinct for backup, when a sudden explosion rocked the street. The force of the blast sent her stumbling back as glass shattered and alarms blared. A building across the street, a small warehouse, was engulfed in flames. Thick black smoke pouring into the sky, chaos erupted as people screamed and ran for cover. Sierra immediately ducked behind a parked car, assessing the situation. The explosion hadn't been random, someone had rigged the warehouse intentionally. But why? Her thoughts were interrupted by the SUV roaring to life. It peeled away from the curb, speeding toward the edge of town. Sierra bolted back to her car, adrenaline pumping. She slammed the door shut, threw on the lights, and took off after the fleeing vehicle. The SUV weaved through traffic at breakneck speed, its driver clearly skilled. Sierra gripped the wheel tightly, her focus razor-sharp. She called into dispatch. "This is Chief Langston. I'm in pursuit of a black SUV heading west on 9th. Possible connection to the explosion on Jefferson Street. I need backup." The dispatcher acknowledged her call, but backup would take time to arrive. Sierra was on her own. The chase led them out of the city and into the wooded outskirts of Crestwood. The narrow, winding roads made it difficult to keep up, but Sierra stayed on the SUV's tail. She could see flashes of movement inside the vehicle, at least 2 occupants, possibly more. Suddenly, the SUV veered onto a dirt road, kicking up a cloud of dust. Sierra followed, her tires skidding slightly on the loose gravel. The road ended at an abandoned quarry, where the SUV came to an abrupt stop. The occupants jumped out, armed with rifles. Sierra barely had time to react as bullets peppered her windshield. She ducked low, grabbing her sidearm and radio. Shots fired. Shots fired at the old quarry. "I'm under fire and requesting immediate assistance." She climbed out of the car, using the door as cover. The suspects had taken up positions behind rocks and machinery, their gunfire relentless. Sierra returned fire, her movements calculated as she advanced toward better cover. The sound of gunshots echoed through the quarry, the tension palpable. One of the suspects tried to flank her, but Sierra spotted him. She fired, grazing his shoulder and forcing him to retreat. Another suspect tossed a grenade-like device toward her. But it landed short, exploding harmlessly against a boulder. Sierra's mind raced. These weren't ordinary criminals. Their tactics and weapons suggested military training, or worse, organized crime. Whoever they were prepared for a fight. Her radio crackled to life as backup arrived, the sound of sirens cutting through the chaos. Patrol cars surrounded the area, and officers poured out, joining the firefight. The suspects, realizing they were outnumbered, retreated into the quarry's deeper tunnels. Sierra motioned for her officers to hold position. "They're cornered," she said. "But we're not going in blind. Secure the perimeter. I want every exit covered." As the officers moved to follow her orders, Sierra stared into the darkness of the quarry tunnels. Whatever was waiting in there, she knew it wasn't over. The quarry's jagged cliffs loomed like sentinels over the chaotic scene, their shadows stretching across the barren landscape. Officers were scattered around the perimeter, their guns drawn, their faces tense. Sierra crouched behind her car, scanning the dark tunnels where the suspects had disappeared. The air was thick with dust, gunpowder, and anticipation. She knew better than to rush in blind. The quarry was an ideal place for an ambush, twisting tunnels, countless hiding spots, and limited visibility. Whoever these men were, they'd chosen this place for a reason. And if their equipment and tactics were any indication, they weren't just some run-of-the-mill criminals, Sergeant Holloway. Sierra called over the crackle of the radio. Status on the perimeter. Perimeter secured, Chief, Holloway's voice came back. No sign of movement outside the tunnels. Good, Sierra replied. Keep everyone alert. These guys aren't amateurs. She signaled 2 officers to join her at the mouth of the largest tunnel. Both looked nervous but nodded, their grips tightening on their weapons. Sierra glanced at them briefly, assessing their readiness. Stay sharp, she said. No one moves until I give the word. The dark tunnel loomed before them, a gaping maw that seemed to swallow the light. Sierra activated the flashlight attached to her weapon, the narrow beam cutting through the blackness. The sound of dripping water echoed faintly, along with the distant scuffle of boots on gravel. The suspects were still moving, and Sierra had no intention of letting them escape. She turned back to the perimeter. Holloway, I want a tactical team here ASAP. We're going to need specialized equipment to flush them out. Already on it, Chief, Holloway confirmed. ETA is 10 minutes. Sierra gritted her teeth. 10 minutes was an eternity in a situation like this, but she didn't have a choice. She needed to keep the suspects pinned until reinforcements arrived. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from deep within the tunnel. It wasn't a gunshot, it was louder, more deliberate. The ground beneath them vibrated slightly. As if something had been detonated further inside. Sierra's heart sank. The suspects were either setting traps or destroying evidence. Either way, the situation had just escalated. Hold your positions. Sierra ordered, her voice firm. She took a step closer to the tunnel's entrance, her flashlight sweeping across the rocky walls. The officers beside her exchanged uneasy glances. Chief, one of them whispered. What if they've got explosives? We could be walking into, they're trying to scare us, Sierra interrupted. Her voice was calm but steely. We don't let them dictate the pace. Focus on the mission. Just then, a figure darted across the tunnel's entrance. It was fast, too fast for her to get a clean shot, but she caught enough of a glimpse to confirm it was one of the suspects. He was carrying a small bag, and his movements were hurried, almost frantic. Suspect spotted. Sierra called out. He's heading toward the northern exit. Holloway, redirect units to cut him off. On it. Holloway replied, his voice clipped with urgency. Sierra motioned for the officers with her to fan out. Stay low. Watch for traps. If you see anything suspicious, call it out immediately. The 3 of them advanced into the tunnel, their footsteps muffled by the loose gravel underfoot. The air grew colder as they moved deeper, the faint smell of sulfur mixing with the damp earth. Sierra's senses were on high alert, every sound amplified in the narrow space. Her flashlight flickered briefly. And she smacked it with her palm to keep it steady. They came upon a crude workstation, a folding table covered in tools, maps, and electronic equipment. Sierra quickly scanned the items, noting the blueprints of a nearby industrial plant and a list of shipment schedules. Whatever these men were planning, it wasn't small. Take pictures of everything, she instructed the officers. Bag anything portable. As they worked, another explosion reverberated through the tunnels, closer this time. Dust and small rocks rained down from the ceiling, and Sierra instinctively shielded her head. Her radio crackled to life. Chief. Holloway's voice was urgent. We've got movement near the northern exit. 2 suspects. One's armed with a rifle, the other's carrying some kind of bag. Keep eyes on them but don't engage, Sierra ordered. Wait for my signal. The officers finished collecting the evidence, and Sierra led them further into the tunnel. The sound of footsteps grew louder ahead, along with hushed voices. She motioned for her team to stop, then crept forward alone, her weapon raised, as she rounded a bend, she spotted the two suspects Holloway had mentioned. They were arguing, their voices echoing faintly off the walls. "This is falling apart," one of them hissed. "We need to leave, now." "Not without the package," the other snapped. "You know what's at stake." Sierra pressed herself against the wall, her heart pounding. She had to act fast. If they got out of the tunnel, it would be nearly impossible to track them down in the surrounding forest. She clicked her radio twice, an agreed-upon signal to Holloway that she was moving in. Then, she stepped out from cover. "Crestwood police," she shouted. "Drop your weapons and get on the ground." The suspects whirled around, their faces masked but clearly startled. The one with the rifle raised it instinctively, but Sierra fired first, hitting him in the shoulder. He cried out, dropping the weapon as he collapsed to the ground. The other suspect bolted, clutching the bag tightly. "Stay down." Sierra barked at the injured man, her weapon trained on him. She glanced back at her officers, who had just caught up. "Secure him." Without waiting for confirmation, Sierra took off after the fleeing suspect. He was fast, but her training gave her the edge. She chased him through the twisting tunnels, the beam of her flashlight bouncing wildly as she sprinted. The suspect burst out of the tunnel into the open air, heading toward a waiting dirt bike. Sierra cursed under her breath and pushed herself harder, closing the distance. Just as he reached the bike, she lunged, tackling him to the ground. The bag flew from his grasp, landing a few feet away. The suspect struggled fiercely, throwing punches and trying to wriggle free. Sierra landed a sharp elbow to his ribs, knocking the wind out of him. She grabbed his wrist and twisted it behind his back, pinning him down. "Stay down," she growled, her knee pressing into his back. The roar of approaching engines signaled the arrival of reinforcements. Patrol cars and tactical units surrounded the area, their lights illuminating the scene. Officers poured out, securing the perimeter and taking the injured suspect into custody. Sierra stood, breathing heavily as she retrieved the bag. She unzipped it cautiously, revealing stacks of cash, electronic components, and a series of handwritten notes. One note in particular caught her attention: Phase 1 complete. Awaiting orders from Crestwood PD contact. Her blood ran cold. A mole. Someone inside the department was working with these criminals. Sierra straightened, her mind racing. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but the picture they formed was darker than she'd imagined. The evidence bag sat on Sierra's desk like a silent accusation. Its contents were damning: the money, the electronics, and the note suggesting a contact within the Crestwood Police Department. Sierra's chest tightened as she stared at the words, "Awaiting orders from Crestwood PD contact." Her office felt smaller, suffocating almost, as the implications weighed on her. Someone inside her department was actively sabotaging her efforts, aiding criminals, and potentially orchestrating the chaos she'd stepped into. Sierra couldn't afford to trust anyone blindly, not even the officers who seemed supportive. She had been in situations like this before, and she knew the most dangerous enemy was often the one closest to you. A knock on the door broke her train of thought. Sergeant Holloway entered, his face grim. "We've finished processing the two suspects," he said, closing the door behind him. "The one you shot in the tunnel is at Crestwood General under guard. The other's refusing to talk. All we've got are aliases." Sierra nodded, her mind racing. "And the quarry itself?" "Cleaned out," Holloway said. "The workstation you found was abandoned, and whoever else was working with them either escaped before we arrived or stayed behind to ensure we didn't find much. We've got a few prints, but it's a long shot." Sierra frowned, tapping her fingers on her desk. "And the SUV? Registered to a fake name. Plates were swapped. We'll keep digging, but these guys know how to cover their tracks." She leaned back in her chair, considering their next move. "What about the cash and the electronics in the bag? Any leads?" Holloway shifted uncomfortably. "The electronics are some kind of encrypted communication devices. Definitely high-end. Tech guys are working on cracking them, but it'll take time. As for the cash, some of it's marked. We traced a few bills to a robbery in Rockford last year." "Rockford," Sierra repeated, her mind immediately connecting dots. "That's a long way from Crestwood." "Exactly," Holloway said. "This isn't local. Whatever these guys are involved in, it's big." Sierra rubbed her temples, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. "What about the department? Any chatter?" Holloway hesitated, then leaned forward. Chief, I don't know if you've noticed, but people are on edge. Some of the older officers, Rick's crew especially, they're acting strange. Defensive. Like they know something's coming but don't want to be caught up in it. Sierra's jaw tightened. Rick Dunbar had been a thorn in her side from the moment they'd crossed paths, and now his behavior was starting to make more sense. If he wasn't directly involved in the corruption, he was at least protecting someone who was. I need you to keep your ears open, Holloway, Sierra said. Quietly. I want to know who's talking to who's acting out of character. And I need you to vet anyone handling this case. If we've got a leak, I don't want them getting their hands on this evidence. Holloway nodded. Understood. Anything else? Sierra stood and grabbed her jacket. Yes. I'm going to have a word with Dunbar. Rick Dunbar was exactly where Sierra expected to find him, in the precinct gym, loudly criticizing the younger officers struggling through their training exercises. He was barking orders, his chest puffed out as he leaned against a weight rack. Come on, Wilson. You call that a squat? My grandmother could do better. Rick's voice boomed, earning forced laughs from the few officers gathered around him. Sierra strode into the gym, her boots echoing on the polished floor. The laughter died as soon as the officers noticed her. Rick, however, didn't turn around until she was just a few feet away. Dunbar, Sierra said sharply. A word. Now. Rick glanced at her over his shoulder, his expression immediately souring. What is it now, Chief? Can't you see I'm busy? Busy inflating your ego, Sierra shot back, her tone cold. Step outside. That's an order. Rick scowled but followed her out of the gym, the weight of the other officer's stares on his back. Sierra led him to an empty interrogation room and shut the door. The sound of the latch clicking echoed ominously. Rick crossed his arms and leaned against the wall. What's this about? Sierra took a step closer, her voice low and dangerous. It's about the fact that someone in this department is dirty. And I think you know more than you're letting on. Rick's eyes narrowed. You've got some nerve, accusing me of. I didn't accuse you of anything, Sierra interrupted. But the way you've been acting since I got here. Defensive. Hostile. Hiding behind bravado because you're terrified of something. So let me make this clear, if you're involved in this, I'll find out. And if you're protecting someone, I'll find that out too. Rick pushed off the wall, his face red with anger. You don't know a damn thing about me. Maybe not, Sierra said. Her voice icy. But I know the type. You've been coasting for years, turning a blind eye to things because it's easier than taking a stand. But guess what, Dunbar? I'm not going anywhere. And the days of this department operating like the Wild West are over. Rick stared at her, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked like it might snap. You're playing a dangerous game, Chief, he growled. You think you're going to walk in here and clean house? You've got no idea what you're up against. Sierra leaned in, her gaze piercing. Then enlighten me. For a moment, Rick looked like he might explode. But instead, he stepped back, a bitter smirk spreading across his face. You'll find out soon enough. Just don't say I didn't warn you. He stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. Sierra stood there for a moment, her blood boiling. Rick's words were vague, but the threat in them was clear. Someone, or something, was pulling strings in Crestwood, and Rick was too entrenched to cut loose willingly. Later that night, Sierra parked her car outside her apartment, exhaustion weighing heavily on her. The day's events had been a whirlwind of tension and revelations, and she knew the road ahead would only get harder. As she stepped out of the car, her phone buzzed again, another text from the unknown number. You're getting close, Chief. Back off while you still can. She scanned the street, her eyes darting between parked cars and darkened windows. The feeling of being watched was undeniable. Her hand instinctively moved toward her sidearm as she made her way inside, locking the door behind her. Sierra placed her phone on the table and stared at it, her mind racing. The threats were escalating, and the corruption was deeper than she'd anticipated. But Sierra Langston didn't back down from a fight. If they thought intimidation would make her quit, they didn't know who they were dealing with. The dawn broke over Crestwood with an eerie stillness, the kind of quiet that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand on end. Chief Sierra Langston stood in her office, gazing at the precinct's parking lot through the blinds. She hadn't slept. The threats, the corruption, and Rick Dunbar's cryptic warning churned in her mind like a storm. Whatever was happening in Crestwood, today felt like the day it would all come to a head. Her phone buzzed on her desk, pulling her from her thoughts. The text was short but direct: "Meet me at Blackthorn Industrial Plant. Come alone. 8 a.m. No sender. No signature." Sierra's instincts screamed that it was a trap, but she didn't hesitate. She grabbed her sidearm, her badge, and a lightweight tactical vest before slipping out of her office. In the squad room, officers were starting their shifts, their chatter filling the air. Sergeant Holloway noticed her leaving and approached. "Chief, everything all right?" he asked, his tone laced with concern. "Not yet," Sierra replied, her voice firm. "I need you to stay on alert. If anything happens, lock this place down. No one leaves without my clearance." Holloway frowned. "Where are you going?" Sierra fixed him with a steady gaze. "To put an end to this. Watch my back." Before he could protest, she walked out, her boots echoing against the tile floor. Outside, the morning air was crisp. And the sun was just starting to rise, casting long shadows across the parking lot. Sierra climbed into her unmarked car and drove toward the outskirts of town, her pulse steady despite the weight of what was coming. The Blackthorn Industrial Plant was a relic of a bygone era, its rusted pipes and crumbling buildings a stark reminder of Crestwood's faded glory. The massive complex had been abandoned for years, its once bustling machinery silenced and overtaken by weeds and decay. Sierra parked her car a safe distance away and approached on foot, her weapon drawn. The faint hum of voices reached her ears as she neared the plant's main building. She crouched behind an old shipping container, her eyes scanning the area. At least 6 armed men patrolled the perimeter, their movements methodical. They weren't just criminals, they were trained. Sierra's grip on her weapon tightened. Whoever was behind this operation had resources, discipline, and a plan. But she had a plan too. Inside the plant, Rick Dunbar paced nervously, his face slick with sweat. He was out of his depth, and it showed. Standing across from him was a man in a tailored suit, his demeanor calm and calculating. His name was Anthony Mercer, a shadowy figure whose name had appeared in organized crime investigations up and down the state, though he'd always managed to stay one step ahead of law enforcement. "She's coming," Mercer said, his voice as smooth as silk. "Are you ready?" Rick glared at him. "This wasn't part of the deal. You said this would stay quiet." Mercer chuckled. "And it has. Until she arrived. Your new chief is tenacious, I'll give her that. But she's just one woman." Rick's jaw tightened. "You don't know her. She's not like the others." Mercer's expression hardened. "Then you'd better hope she's smart enough to walk away. Because if she doesn't..." He gestured to the men stationed around the plant. "She won't leave here alive." Sierra slipped into the building through a side entrance, her footsteps silent on the concrete floor. The interior was a labyrinth of rusting machinery, dimly lit by flickering overhead lights. She moved carefully, keeping to the shadows as she followed the sound of voices. Her heart rate remained steady, her training taking over. As she rounded a corner, she spotted 2 guards stationed by a staircase. They were armed, but their attention was divided as they talked quietly. Sierra acted quickly, moving in behind them. A swift strike to the back of one man's head sent him crumpling to the ground. The other turned, but Sierra disarmed him with a quick twist of his wrist before knocking him out with a well-placed elbow. She dragged their unconscious bodies into a dark corner, taking one of their radios before continuing up the stairs. Rick's anxiety spiked as the radio crackled. "Southwest entrance secure." "No sign of movement," one of the guards reported, but Mercer wasn't convinced. He tapped his watch, signaling 2 of his men to sweep the building. "She's here," he said quietly. "It's just a matter of time." Rick's fists clenched at his sides. He had spent years bullying his way through Crestwood, bending the rules and intimidating anyone who challenged him. But this was different. Sierra Langston wasn't someone he could bully or scare. She was smarter, tougher, and relentless. And deep down, Rick knew he had underestimated her. Sierra navigated the plant with precision, using the stolen radio to monitor the guards' movements. She disabled 2 more men on the upper level, her strikes efficient and silent. Her path led her to a catwalk overlooking the main floor, where she finally spotted Mercer, Rick, and the remaining guards. Her eyes narrowed as she assessed the situation. Rick was visibly agitated, while Mercer appeared calm and in control. The guards were spread out, their weapons at the ready. Sierra needed a plan, and fast. She grabbed a wrench from a nearby workbench and hurled it across the room. The clanging sound echoed, drawing the attention of two guards. As they moved to investigate, Sierra descended the catwalk, her movements swift and deliberate. One by one, she took out the guards, using their own confusion against them. A flashbang she had retrieved from her tactical vest disoriented the remaining men, giving her the opening she needed to disarm them. By the time the dust settled, only Mercer and Rick remained. Sierra leveled her weapon at them as she stepped into the open. "It's over," she said, her voice steady. "Drop your weapons." Mercer raised his hands, a sly smile on his face. "Impressive, Chief. You've got skills. But you're out of your depth." Rick, however, wasn't as composed. His hands shook as he stared at Sierra, the weight of his choices crashing down on him. "I didn't have a choice," he blurted. "They had me cornered." "Save it," Sierra snapped, her eyes locked on Mercer. "You're both going down for this." Mercer chuckled. "I wouldn't be so sure." With a sudden motion, he pressed a button on a small device in his hand. The floor rumbled as an explosion rocked the far side of the building. Flames and smoke began to spread rapidly. Sierra lunged forward, tackling Rick to the ground as debris rained down. Mercer used the chaos to make his escape, disappearing into the shadows. Sierra cursed under her breath, but she couldn't pursue him, not yet. She grabbed Rick by the collar and dragged him to his feet. "You're coming with me," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Rick didn't resist. His bravado was gone, replaced by fear and regret. Together, they stumbled out of the building as the fire consumed it. Sirens wailing in the distance. Hours later, back at the precinct, Rick sat in an interrogation room, his head in his hands. Sierra watched him through the one-way glass, her expression unreadable. Holloway approached, his face grim. "What now?" he asked. Sierra's eyes didn't leave Rick. "We flip him. He knows enough to bring this whole operation down." "And Mercer?" Holloway asked. Sierra's jaw tightened. "He's still out there. But this isn't over." As she turned away from the glass, her phone buzzed. Another message from the unknown number. "You won the battle, Chief. But the war is just beginning." Sierra stared at the message, her resolve hardening. Whoever was behind this had underestimated her. And she wasn't about to back down. For the first time in years, Crestwood had a real leader, and Sierra Langston wasn't going anywhere. Hope you enjoyed this thrilling ride through Sierra Langston's fight to bring justice to Crestwood. From dodging bullets to exposing corruption, Sierra's journey is proof that standing up for what's right isn't easy, but it's always worth it. What do you think will happen next in Crestwood? Will Sierra finally bring down the hidden forces working against her, or will Mercer strike back even harder? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your theories. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share so you never miss another action-packed tale. Thanks for tuning in, and stay ready for more stories that'll keep you on the edge of your seat. See you next time. Smiling face with smiling eyes.